Hello again, everybody. Today's lesson should be for Tuesday, April 1st. And so, based on yesterday's AI activity, you were essentially introduced to an event uh, that occurred in Chicago in 1886 called the Haymarket Square Riot. And so today I am going to provide a little bit of background information to you to tell you the story both nationally and locally about the events that led up to um, this Haymarket Square riot, the riot itself, and the aftermath, the consequences of the riot. So you should have in your Google Classroom and perhaps even a physical copy set of questions that uh, follow along with this PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so I just ask that as you listen to me that you complete those questions so that you can again understand what led up to what happened during and what happened as a consequence of this Haymarket Square riot, because we're going to be looking at this event a little bit more closely over the next few days. Okay, so uh, let's begin. First, a little bit of background information. I want you to be familiar with two terms. Okay, first, anarchism, and those who believe in anarchism are known as anarchists. Okay, anarchists, and then nativism, and those who believe in that term are nativists. And these are two groups who are kind of clashing and competing at this time because of the labor movement that we studied before spring break. So anarchists and anarchism itself. Uh, if you are an anarchist, then you would believe that both the government and capitalism itself, the economic system in the United States and across the world, were oppressive systems that were exploiting workers, these low wage immigrant workers, taking advantage of the workers for the improvement, for the betterment of the business class, those who own those factories. Uh, these anarchists essentially were advocating for a stateless society, a society where there was no government in control. Okay, so they wanted to do away with government, with laws, so that the workers themselves could control the means of production. So no longer would businesses and business owners control the factories and what was decided of what was going to be produced. The workers themselves would make those decisions. Okay, so they would reject the state authority, private ownership. This is essentially just a socialist society. Okay. And then they often engaged in order to kind of fight back against the system, they often engaged in direct action, which would include things like strikes, protests, and perhaps even violence to challenge that status quo, to try to overthrow that system and improve their own lives. Okay, so this was a strategy that some of the workers would engage in, and belief that these some of these European workers believed in. Okay, not all of these workers were anarchists. This was a very extreme group, but I want us to be familiar with this term because the workers themselves that are going to be involved in this case identified as anarchists. Okay, and then the second term I want us to be familiar with is nativism. Okay, and nativists and nativism itself is a policy or a belief that favors the interests of native-born inhabitants of a country. So many native-born Americans, not Native Americans, but native-born Americans. So think of like your white Anglo-Saxon European um, American citizen who was living here for decades, centuries, who came from England. Okay, these native-born inhabitants believe that they are essentially superior to any immigrant group. Okay, so this idea of nativism was fueled by a growing fear and a sense of hostility, tension toward immigrant groups, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe, the groups who we saw arrive during this time period. And it was fueled by a belief that these immigrants were taking American jobs, that they were taking away the jobs from true Americans and driving down American wages. Sound familiar? All right, this idea is not something new, right? This is just a rinse and repeat of what we have been looking at for centuries. And then last point I want us to understand about nativism and nativists is that these nativists believe that the influx of immigrants was not just going to take away American jobs and drive down wages for true Americans, right? But that immigrants themselves, the influx of immigrants to the United States would undermine American values, that this would strip away the American identity and thus would kind of cause a threat to the social and economic stability. So these nativists really viewed immigrants themselves as a threat to the country, something that needed to be neutralized and removed. Again, not something new, right? This rhetoric that we hear today in our modern world is not something new. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of what led up to the Haymarket Square riot as I pull up my notes here to read along with you. So first event I want us to be familiar with was the Transcontinental Railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869. So this was a railroad that went across the entire country, as you see here. Okay, it would begin in New York and take you all the way through Chicago to Council Bluffs, Iowa here in Omaha. And then could take you all the way to San Francisco. Okay, so in order for this railroad to be completed, okay, lots of immigrants were needed, both those from Asia, as we'll look at in a future lesson, and those from Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay. Second thing was the Knights of Labor. This was one of the first, as we looked at before, one of the very first major labor unions at this time. Okay, so they were helping immigrants to band together, these low wage workers to band together, to organize, to strike for better working conditions, better wages, and as we'll see, the 8-hour workday. This group was formed in 1873. Okay, same year, 1873, we see a panic, an economic panic, similar to the one that we looked at earlier this year when we talked about Andrew Jackson and the Panic of 1837, right? 1873, we see another economic panic where we see rising inflation. So prices are dramatically increasing. Unemployment rate, as a result, dramatically increasing. And unfortunately, at this time, there wasn't a lot of government. There was none. There was no government oversight in order to protect these workers. So workers were just fired. There was no unemployment. There was no government assistance. So these low wage workers were essentially just fending for themselves, hoping that charity would be provided by your average, wealthy person. And if that charity wasn't given, then these people would suffer and perhaps die. Just 4 years later, we see a railroad strike in 1877, a great railroad strike in 1877, where we see groups of railroad workers who are striking because of the dramatic reduction in wages. They're fighting for better wages, better working conditions, better treatment from their bosses. So again, we see workers kind of banding together, this tension between those who own the means of production and those who are working. Okay, they're clashing against each other. They're fighting. This is all, we're talking about this on a national level. Okay. And about 7 to 8 years later, okay, 1883, 1884, we see the beginning of an 8-hour workday movement where these workers are working together, okay, banding together, organizing to fight for an 8-hour workday so that the day could be divided where you have 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest at home, 8 hours so you kind of do what you want to do on your own, right? All that adds up to your 24-hour period. Okay, so that workers were not being forced to work for 15, 16 hours a day and then have no time for themselves. Again, the workers really liked this idea. Those who didn't like it were the business owners, the factory owners. Okay, so we see this tension between workers and business owners on a national level. Now, I want us to shift from the big national scale to Chicago itself. Okay, so on May 3rd, 1886, okay, we have all this tension between immigrants and nativists who view immigrants as a threat to the country, right? Workers are fighting for a better life, better working conditions, okay? And up to this point in 1886, Chicago had become a very tense location, a very tense place, deeply divided. After the Civil War, it grew rapidly, even uncontrollably. Tens of thousands of workers labored long hours for very low wages in those factories, just as we saw on a national level. In factories, warehouses, stockyards, a huge demand for laborers made Chicago a magnet for immigrants from Germany, from Poland, from Italy, okay, from Ireland, and many other nations. As they struggled to find their way in a strange land, these immigrants were often met with suspicion and hostility. Many native-born Chicagoans, those nativists, saw these immigrants as a threat to the social order and their more traditional way of life. What we saw then were struggles between those unions and the factory owners. Those powerful business owners fought bitterly to keep the unions out. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, several strikes led to riots and violent clashes between the police and the workers. So we're going to look at one of those instances right here. Okay, so on May 3rd, 1886, at the McCormick Reaper Works factory, a strike, the strike that we see here is one for an 8-hour workday. Okay, these workers at the McCormick Reaper factory are striking for an 8-hour workday. This strike becomes violent, and the police killed 4 of those workers who were striking, again, for an 8-hour workday. Some of those workers were anarchists, and some of those anarchists met that night to develop a plan for a protest the next day. Again, they're protesting now not for an 8-hour workday, but they're protesting the police violence. And they were going to hold a rally on May 4th, the next day, at Haymarket Square. Okay, this rally would include speeches about the police violence, and again, being organized by anarchists, they would be arguing not just for better treatment, better working conditions, and the 8-hour workday, but also arguing for the overthrow of the government. Okay, perhaps even using violent means. And again, these guys they're angry, they're frustrated with the police violence. Those police officers represent the government, and they just use violence against these immigrants to keep the system the way it is, to prevent these immigrants from changing the traditional American way of life. So on May 4th, this rally is held. Speeches are given. The rally was organized by a group of German immigrants who identified as anarchists. They included guys like Samuel Fielden, Albert Parsons, and August Spies. Okay, so 3 of these men who organized this event are on the screen here. Now, we know that there was a great sense of fear from these nativists, that they viewed the immigrants as a threat to the country. And their goal was to prevent any kind of a change, that these nativists didn't want immigrants to change their way of life, to change their country. So on May 4th, 1886, this rally occurs. And these frustrated men are giving their speeches when suddenly a bomb goes off. Okay. Bomb goes off at Haymarket Square rally, where there are dozens and dozens of police officers, attendees, etc. The bombing took place at the high point of this movement at this point. Okay, so this bomb here was the evidence. In this explosion, Officer Matthias J. Deegan, one of the Chicago police officers who was in attendance there to keep the people safe, was killed. And in the days and weeks following, 8 of the organizers, these men here, are arrested. They include August Spies, Albert Parsons, Louis Ling, George Engel, Michael Schwab, Samuel Fielden, Oscar Neebe, and Adolf Fischer. All of them German, all of them identified as anarchists, and all of them were involved in organizing this labor rally on May 4th, again, in response to the police violence that occurred the previous day on May 3rd. These Haymarket Square organizers were put on trial. And what we see in Chicago is that these citizens, these nativist citizens, were terrified. They directed their anger and frustration and rage at the anarchist leaders of the protests. These men, these 8 men, were convicted of inciting violence, even though none of them were linked to the bomb itself, but they were convicted solely based on the fact that they organized an event where a bomb went off. So none of them could be tied to the bombing itself. All right. In response, what we see is 4 of those 8 men were hung by the city of Chicago in the state of Illinois. So 4 of them were executed for their supposed crimes. 1 of them committed suicide, and the other 3 languished in prison. Now, most historians today agree that the Haymarket trial itself, was deeply flawed. Witnesses were highly unreliable. They were very much biased against these 8 men. The judge was openly hostile to those defendants. And only people already suspicious of the anarchists were allowed on the jury. So the jury was already biased against these men. So of course they were convicted. What we see in the aftermath, though, is that by 1893, so just 6-7 years later, reform-minded governor of Illinois, Altgeld, decides to pardon the 3 remaining defendants. So they are released from prison. They are forgiven for their crimes. Okay. And today we see a statue erected to remember this event. Okay. What I want us to make sure that we understand is that from the documents that we're going to read, you're not going to be able to decide whether you think these people were innocent or guilty. Okay. But instead, I want us to make sure that we understand the big ideas from this event, the ideas of the anarchists and the views of their critics. Your task, again, is not to be a jury to decide their innocence or their guilt. Instead, it is to understand the radicalism of the late 1800s and the views of those who opposed it, the nativists and the anarchists. We're going to be looking at several documents over the next couple of days. Those documents are going to help you to debate the larger meaning of the Haymarket Square riot, both nationally and locally to the people of Chicago. Okay, so if you have any questions, please review the big ideas from this this presentation. Okay, and I'm going to stop here.